Bravo, my dear geographer, said Glenarvan. That is very well put. Unless the race has no existence, that would reconcile all statements, returned Paganel. But here is one consolation, at all events. The Straits of Magellan are very magnificent, even without Patagonians. Just at this moment, the Duncan was rounding the peninsula of Brunswick, between splendid panoramas. 70 miles after doubling Cape Gregory, she left on her starboard the penitentiary of Punta Arena. The church steeple and the Chilean flag gleamed for an instant among the trees, and then the straight wound on between huge granitic masses which had an imposing effect. Cloud-capped mountains appeared, their heads white with eternal snows, and their feet hid in immense forests. Toward the southwest, Mount Tarn rose 6,500 feet high. Night came on after a long lingering twilight, the light insensibly melting away into soft shades. These brilliant constellations began to bestud the sky, and the Southern Cross shone out. There were numerous bays along the shore, easy of access, but the yacht did not drop anchor in any. She continued her course fearlessly through the luminous darkness. Presently ruins came in sight, crumbling buildings, which the night invested with grandeur, the sad remains of a deserted settlement, whose name will be an eternal protest against these fertile shores and forests full of game. The Duncan was passing Fort Famine. It was in that very spot that Sarmiento, a Spaniard, came in 1581 with 400 emigrants to establish a colony. He founded the city of St. Philip, but the extreme severity of winter decimated the inhabitants, and those who had struggled through the cold died subsequently of starvation. Cavendish, the corsair, discovered the last survivor dying of hunger in the ruins. After sailing along these deserted shores, the Duncan went through a series of narrow passes, between forests of beech and ash and birch, and at length doubled Cape Froward, still bristling with the ice of the last winter. On the other side of the strait, in Terra del Fuego, stood Mount Sarmiento, towering to a height of 6,000 feet, an enormous accumulation of rocks, separated by bands of cloud, forming a sort of aerial archipelago in the sky. It is at Cape Froward that the American continent actually terminates, for Cape Horn is nothing but a rock sunk in the sea in latitude 52 degrees. At Cape Maumax the straits widened, and she was able to get round Narborough Isles and advance in a more southerly direction, till at length the rock of Cape Pillars, the extreme point of Desolation Island, came in sight 36 hours after entering the straits. Before her stem lay a broad, open, sparkling ocean, which Jacques Paganel greeted with enthusiastic gestures, feeling kindred emotions with those which stirred the bosom of Ferdinand de Magellan himself, when the sails of his ship, the Trinidad, first bent before the breeze from the great Pacific. Chapter 10. The course decided. A week after they had doubled the Cape Pillars, the Duncan steamed into the Bay of Talcahuano, a magnificent estuary, 12 miles long and 9 broad. The weather was splendid. From November to March, the sky is always cloudless, and a constant south wind prevails, as the coast is sheltered by the mountain range of the Andes. In obedience to Lord Glenarvan's order, John Mangles had sailed as near the archipelago of Chiloe as possible, and examined all the creeks and windings of the coast, hoping to discover some traces of the shipwreck. A broken spar, or any fragment of the vessel, would have put them in the right track, but nothing whatever was visible, and the yacht continued her route, till she dropped anchor at the port of Talcahuano, 42 days from the time she had sailed out of the fogs of the Clyde. Glenarvan had a boat lowered immediately, and went on shore, accompanied by Paganel. The learned geographer gladly availed himself of the opportunity of making use of the language he had been studying so conscientiously, but to his great amazement, found he could not make himself understood by the people. "It is the accent I've not got," he said. "Let us go to the custom house," replied Glenarvan. They were informed on arriving there, by means of a few English words, aided by expressive gestures, that the British consul lived at Conception, an hour's ride distant. Glenarvan found no difficulty in procuring 2 fleet horses, and he and Paganel were soon within the walls of the great city, due to the enterprising genius of Valdivia, the valiant comrade of the Pizarros. How it was shorn of its ancient splendor. Often pillaged by the natives, burned in 1819, it lay in desolation and ruins, its walls still blackened by the flames, scarcely numbering 8,000 inhabitants and already eclipsed by Talcahuano. The grass was growing in the streets, beneath the lazy feet of the citizens, and all trade and business, indeed any description of activity, was impossible. The notes of the mandolin resounded from every balcony, and languishing songs floated on the breeze. Conception, the ancient city of brave men, had become a village of women and children. Lord Glenarvan felt no great desire to inquire into the causes of this decay, though Paganel tried to draw him into a discussion on the subject. He would not delay an instant, but went straight on to the house of Mr. Bentinck, Her Majesty's consul, who received them very courteously, and on learning their errand, undertook to make inquiries all along the coast. But to the question whether a three-mast vessel, called the Britannia, had gone ashore either on the Chilean or Araucanian coast, he gave a decided negative. No report of such an event had been made to him or any of the other consuls. Glenarvan, however, would not allow himself to be disheartened. He went back to Talcahuano and spared neither pains nor expense to make a thorough investigation of the whole seaboard. But it was all in vain. The most minute inquiries were fruitless, and Lord Glenarvan returned to the yacht to report his ill success. Mary Grant and her brother could not restrain their grief. Lady Helena did her best to comfort them by loving caresses, while Jacques Paganel took up the document and began studying it again. He had been poring over it for more than an hour when Glenarvan interrupted him and said, "Paganel, I appeal to your sagacity. Have we made an erroneous interpretation of the document? Is there anything illogical about the meaning?" Paganel was silent, absorbed in reflection. "Have we mistaken the place where the catastrophe occurred?" continued Glenarvan. "Does not the name Patagonia seem apparent even to the least clear-sighted individual?" Paganel was still silent. "Besides," said Glenarvan, "does not the word Indian prove we are right?" "Perfectly so," replied McNabbs. "And is it not evident, then, that, at the moment of writing the words, the shipwrecked men were expecting to be made prisoners by the Indians?" "I take exception to that, my lord," said Paganel, "and even if your other conclusions are right, this, at least, seemed to me irrational." "What do you mean?" asked Lady Helena, while all eyes were fixed on the geographer. "I mean this," replied Paganel, "that Captain Grant is now a prisoner among the Indians, and I further add that the document states it unmistakably." "Explain yourself, sir," said Mary Grant. "Nothing is plainer, dear Mary. Instead of reading the document seront prisonniers, read sont prisonniers, and the whole thing is clear." "But that is impossible," replied Lord Glenarvan. "Impossible, and why, my noble friend?" asked Paganel, smiling. "Because the bottle could only have been thrown into the sea just when the vessel went to pieces on the rocks, and consequently, the latitude and longitude given refer to the actual place of the shipwreck." "There is no proof of that," replied Paganel, "and I see nothing to preclude the supposition that the poor fellows were dragged into the interior by the Indians, and sought to make known the place of their captivity by means of this bottle. Except this fact, my dear Paganel, that there was no sea, and therefore they could not have flung the bottle into it." "Unless they flung it into rivers which ran into the sea," returned Paganel. This reply was so unexpected, and yet so admissible, that it made them all completely silent for a minute, though their beaming eyes betrayed the rekindling of hope in their hearts. Lady Helena was the first to speak. "What an idea!" she exclaimed. "And what a good idea!" was Paganel's naive rejoinder to her exclamation. "What would you advise, then?" said Glenarvan. "My advice is to follow the 37th parallel from the point where it touches the American continent to where it dips into the Atlantic, without deviating from it half a degree, and possibly in some part of its course, we shall fall in with the shipwrecked party." "There is a poor chance of that," said the Major. "Poor as it is," returned Paganel, "we ought not to lose it. If I am right in my conjecture that the bottle has been carried into the sea on the bosom of some river, we cannot fail to find the track of the prisoners. You can easily convince yourselves of this by looking at this map of the country." He unrolled a map of Chile and the Argentine provinces as he spoke, and spread it out on the table. "Just follow me for a moment," he said, "across the American continent. Let us make a stride across the narrow strip of Chile, and over the Cordilleras of the Andes, and get into the heart of the Pampas. Shall we find any lack of rivers and streams and currents? No, for here are the Rio Negro and Rio Colorado, and their tributaries intersected by the 37th parallel, and any of them might have carried the bottle on its waters. Then, perhaps, in the midst of a tribe in some Indian settlement, on the shores of these almost unknown rivers, those whom I may call my friends await some providential intervention. Ought we to disappoint their hopes? Do you not all agree with me that it is our duty to go along the line my finger is pointing out at this moment on the map, And if after all we find I have been mistaken, still to keep straight on and follow the 37th parallel, till we find those we seek, if even we go right round the world. His generous enthusiasm so touched his auditors that, involuntarily, they rose to their feet and grasped his hands, while Robert exclaimed as he devoured the map with his eyes, "Yes, my father is there." "And where he is," replied Glenarvan, "we'll manage to go, my boy, and find him. Nothing can be more logical than Paganel's theory, and we must follow the course he points out without the least hesitation. Captain Grant may have fallen into the hands of a numerous tribe, or his captors may be but a handful. In the latter case, we shall carry him off at once. But in the event of the former, after we have reconnoitered the situation, we must go back to the Duncan on the eastern coast and get to Buenos Aires, where we can soon organize a detachment of men, with Major McNabbs at their head, strong enough to tackle all the Indians in the Argentine provinces." "That's capital, my lord," said John Mangles, "and I may add that there is no danger whatever crossing the continent." "Monsieur Paganel," asked Lady Helena, "you have no fear then that if the poor fellows have fallen into the hands of the Indians, their lives at least have been spared?" "What a question! Why, madam, the Indians are not anthropophagy, far from it. One of my own countrymen, M. Ginnard, associated with me in the Geographical Society, was 3 years a prisoner among the Indians in the Pampas. He had to endure sufferings and ill treatment, but came off victorious at last. A European is a useful being in these countries. The Indians know his value and take care of him as if he were some costly animal." "There is not the least room then for hesitation," said Lord Glenarvan. "Go we must, and as soon as possible. What route must we take?" "One that is both easy and agreeable," replied Paganel. "Rather mountainous at first, and then sloping gently down the eastern side of the Andes into a smooth plain, turfed and gravelled quite like a garden." "Let us see the map," said the Major. "Here it is, my dear McNabbs. We shall go through the capital of Araucania, and cut the Cordilleras by the pass of Antuco, leaving the volcano on the south, and gliding gently down the mountain sides, past the Neuquén and the Rio Colorado onto the Pampas, till we reach the Sierra Tapalquén, from whence we shall see the frontier of the province of Buenos Aires. These we shall pass by, and cross over the Sierra Tandil, pursuing our search to the very shores of the Atlantic as far as Point Medano." Paganel went through this program of the expedition without so much as a glance at the map. He was so posted up in the travels of Frezier, Molina, Humboldt, Mears, and Orbigny that he had the geographical nomenclature at his fingers' ends and could trust implicitly to his never-failing memory. "You see then, friend," he added, "that it is a straight course. In 30 days we shall have gone over it and gained the eastern side before the Duncan, however little she may be delayed by the westerly winds." "Then the Duncan is to cruise between Corrientes and Cape St. Anthony," said John Mangles. "Just so." "And how is the expedition to be organized?" asked Glenarvan. "As simply as possible. All there is to be done is to reconnoiter the situation of Captain Grant and not to come to gunshot with the Indians. I think that Lord Glenarvan, our natural leader, the Major, who would not yield his place to anybody, and your humble servant, Jacques Paganel." "And me," interrupted Robert. "Robert, Robert," exclaimed Mary. "And why not?" returned Paganel. "Travels form the youthful mind. Yes, Robert, we 4 and 3 of the sailors." "And does your lordship mean to pass me by?" said John Mangles, addressing his master. "My dear John," replied Glenarvan, "we leave passengers on board, those dearer to us than life, and who is to watch over them but the devoted captain?" "Then we can't accompany you?" said Lady Helena, while a shade of sadness beclouded her eyes. "My dear Helena, the journey will so soon be accomplished that it will be but a brief separation, and—" "Yes, dear, I understand, it is all right, and I do hope you may succeed." "Besides, you can hardly call it a journey," added Paganel. "What is it, then?" "It is just making a flying passage across the continent, the way a good man goes through the world, doing all the good he can. Transfer beneficendo, that is our motto." This ended the discussion, if a conversation can be so called, where all who take part in it are of the same opinion. Preparations commenced the same day, but as secretly as possible to prevent the Indians getting scent of it. The day of departure was fixed for the 14th of October. The sailors were all so eager to join the expedition that Glenarvan found the only way to prevent jealousy among them was to draw lots who should go. This was accordingly done, and fortune favored the chief officer, Tom Austin, Wilson, a strong, jovial young fellow, and Mulready, so good a boxer that he might have entered the lists with Tom Sayers himself. Glenarvan displayed the greatest activity about the preparations, for he was anxious to be ready by the appointed day. John Mangles was equally busy in coaling the vessel, that she might weigh anchor at the same time. There was quite a rivalry between Glenarvan and the young captain about getting first to the Argentine coast. Both were ready on the 14th. The whole search party assembled in the saloon to bid farewell to those who remained behind. The Duncan was just about to get under way, and already the vibration of the screw began to agitate the limpid waters of Talcahuano. Glenarvan, Paganel, McNabbs, Robert Grant, Tom Austin, Wilson, and Mulready stood armed with carbines and Colt's revolvers. Guides and mules awaited them at the landing stairs of the harbor. "It is time," said Lord Glenarvan at last. "Go then, dear Edward," said Lady Helena, restraining her emotion. Lord Glenarvan clasped her closely to his breast for an instant, and then turned away, while Robert flung his arms round Mary's neck. "And now, friends," said Paganel, "let's have one good hearty shake of the hand all round, to last us till we get to the shores of the Atlantic." This was not much to ask, but he certainly got strong enough grips to go some way towards satisfying his desire. All went on deck now, and the 7 explorers left the vessel. They were soon on the quay, and as the yacht turned round to pursue her course, she came so near where they stood that Lady Helena could exchange farewells once more. "God help you," she called out. "Heaven will help us, madam," shouted Paganel in reply, "for you may be sure we'll help ourselves." "Go on," sung out the captain to his engineer. At the same moment, Lord Glenarvan gave the signal to start, and away went the mules along the coast, while the Duncan steamed out at full speed toward the broad ocean. Chapter 11: Traveling in Chile. The native troops organized by Lord Glenarvan consisted of 3 men and a boy. The captain of the muleteers was an Englishman, who had become naturalized through 20 years' residence in the country. He made a livelihood by letting out mules to travelers, and leading them over the difficult passes of the Cordilleras, after which he gave them in charge of a Baquino, or Argentine guide, to whom the route through the Pampas was perfectly familiar. This Englishman had not so far forgotten his mother tongue among mules and Indians that he could not converse with his countrymen, and a lucky thing it was for them, as Lord Glenarvan found it far easier to give orders than to see them executed. Paganel was still unsuccessful in making himself understood. The Castaways, as he was called in Chilean, had 2 natives called peons, and a boy about 12 years of age under him. The peons took care of the baggage mules, and the boy led the madrina, a young mare adorned with rattle and bells, which walked in front, followed by 10 mules. The travelers rode 7 of these, and the Castaways another. The remaining 2 carried provisions and a few bales of goods, intended to secure the goodwill of the caciques of the plain. The peons walked, according to their usual habit. Every arrangement had been made to ensure safety and speed, for crossing the Andes is something more than an ordinary journey. It could not be accomplished without the help of the hardy mules of the far-famed Argentine breed. Those reared in the country are much superior to their progenitors. They are not particular about their food, and only drink once a day, and they can go with ease 10 leagues in 8 hours. There are no inns along this road from one ocean to another. The only viands on which travelers can regale themselves are dried meat, rice seasoned with pimento, and such game as may be shot en route. The torrents provide them with water in the mountains, and the rivulets in the plains, which they improve by the addition of a few drops of rum, and each man carries a supply of this in a bullock's horn, called chiffle. They have to be careful, however, not to indulge too freely in alcoholic drinks, as the climate itself has a peculiarly exhilarating effect on the nervous system. As for bedding, it is all contained in the saddle used by the natives, called recado. This saddle is made of sheepskins, tanned on one side and woolly on the other, fastened by gorgeous embroidered straps. Wrapped in these warm coverings, a traveler may sleep soundly and brave exposure to the damp nights. Glenarvan, an experienced traveler, who knew how to adapt himself to the customs of other countries, adopted the Chilean costume for himself and his whole party. Paganel and Robert, both alike children, though of different growth, were wild with delight as they inserted their heads in the national poncho, an immense plaid with a hole in center, and their legs in high leather boots. The mules were richly caparisoned, with the Arab bit in their mouths and long reins of plaited leather, which served as a whip. The headstall of the bridle was decorated with metal ornaments, and the alforjas double sacks of gay-colored linen, containing the day's provisions. Paganel, distrait as usual, was flung several times before he succeeded in bestriding his good steed, but once in the saddle, his inseparable telescope on his shoulder belt, he held on well enough, keeping his feet fast in the stirrups and trusting entirely to the sagacity of his beast. As for Robert, his first attempt at mounting was successful, and proved that he had the making in him of an excellent horseman. The weather was splendid when they started, the sky a deep cloudless blue, and yet the atmosphere so tempered by the sea breezes as to prevent any feeling of oppressive heat. They marched rapidly along the winding shore of the Bay of Talcahuano, in order to gain the extremity of the parallel, 30 miles south. No one spoke much the first day, for the smoke of the Duncan was still visible on the horizon, and the pain of parting too keenly felt. Paganel talked to himself in Spanish, asking and answering questions. The Castaways, moreover, was a taciturn man naturally, and had not been rendered loquacious by his calling. He hardly spoke to his peons. They understood their duties perfectly. If one of the mules stopped, they urged it on with a guttural cry, and if that proved unavailing, a good-sized pebble, thrown with unerring aim, soon cured the animal's obstinacy. If a strap got loose or a rein fell, a peon came forward instantly, and throwing off his poncho, flung it over his beast's head till the accident was repaired and the march resumed. The custom of the muleteers is to start immediately after breakfast, about 8 o'clock, and not to stop till they camp for the night. About 4 p.m. Glenarvan fell in with the practice, and the first halt was just as they arrived at Arauco, situated at the very extremity of the bay. To find the extremity of the 37th degree of latitude, they would have required to proceed as far as the Bay of Carnero, 20 miles further. But the agents of Glenarvan had already scoured that part of the coast, and to repeat the exploration would have been useless. It was, therefore, decided that Arauco should be the point of departure, and they should keep on from there toward the east in a straight line. Since the weather was so favorable, and the whole party, even Robert, were in perfect health, and altogether the journey had commenced under such favorable auspices, it was deemed advisable to push forward as quickly as possible. Accordingly, the next day they marched miles or more, and encamped at nightfall on the banks of Rio Biobio. The country still presented the same fertile aspect, and abounded in flowers, but animals of any sort only came in sight occasionally, and there were no birds visible, except a solitary heron or owl, and a thrush or grebe flying from the falcon. Human beings there were none, not a native appeared. Not even one of the Guasos, the degenerate offspring of Indians and Spaniards, dashed across the plain like a shadow, his flying steed dripping with blood from the cruel thrusts inflicted by the gigantic spurs of his master's naked feet. It was absolutely impossible to make inquiries when there was no one to address, and Lord Glenarvan came to the conclusion that Captain Grant must have been dragged right over the Andes into the Pampas, and that it would be useless to search for him elsewhere. The only thing to be done was to wait patiently and press forward with all the speed in their power. On the 17th, they set out in the usual line of march, a line which it was hard work for Robert to keep. His ardor constantly compelled him to get ahead of the Madrina, to the great despair of his mule. Nothing but a sharp recall from Glenarvan kept the boy in proper order. The country now became more diversified, and the rising ground indicated their approach to a mountainous district. Rivers were more numerous and came rushing noisily down the slopes. Paganel consulted his maps, and when he found any of those streams not marked, which often happened, all the fire of a geographer burned in his veins, and he would exclaim, with a charming air of vexation, "A river which hasn't a name is like having no civil standing. It has no existence in the eye of geographical law." He christened them forthwith, without the least hesitation, and marked them down on the map, qualifying them with the most high-sounding adjectives he could find in the Spanish language. "What a language," he said. "How full and sonorous it is. It is like the metal church bells are made of, composed of 78 parts of copper and 22 of tin." "But, I say, do you make any progress in it?" asked Glenarvan. "Most certainly, my dear lord. Ah, if it wasn't the accent, that wretched accent." And for want of better work, Paganel whiled away the time along the road by practicing the difficulties in pronunciation, repeating all the breakjaw words he could, though still making geographical observations. Any question about the country that Glenarvan might ask the Castaways was sure to be answered by the learned Frenchman before he could reply, to the great astonishment of the guide, who gazed at him in bewilderment. About 2 o'clock that same day, they came to a crossroad, and naturally enough Glenarvan inquired the name of it. "It is the route from Youmbal to Los Angeles," said Paganel. Glenarvan looked at the Catapez, who replied, "Quite right." And then, turning toward the geographer, he added, "You have traveled in these parts before, sir." "Oh yes," said Paganel quite gravely. "On a mule?" "No, in an easy chair." The Catapez could not make him out, but shrugged his shoulders and resumed his post at the head of the party. At 5 in the evening they stopped in a gorge of no great depth, some miles above the little town of Loja, and encamped for the night at the foot of the Sierras, the first steps of the great Cordilleras. Chapter 12, 11,000 feet aloft. Nothing of importance had occurred hitherto in the passage through Chile, but all the obstacles and difficulties incident to a mountain journey were about to crowd on the travelers now. One important question had first to be settled: which pass would take them over the Andes, and yet not be out of their fixed route? On questioning the Catapez on the subject, he replied, "There are only two practicable passes that I know of in this part of the Cordilleras. The Pass of Arica is one undoubtedly discovered by Valdivia Mendoza," said Paganel. "Just so. And that of Valerica is the other." "Precisely." "Well, my good fellow, both these passes have only one fault: they take us too far out of our route, either north or south." "Have you no other to propose?" asked the major. "Certainly," replied Paganel. "There is the Pass of Antuco, on the slope of the volcano, in latitude 37 degrees 30, or, in other words, only half a degree out of our way." "That would do, but are you acquainted with this Pass of Antuco, Catapez?" said Glenarvan. "Yes, your lordship, I have been through it, but I did not mention it, as no one goes that way but the Indian shepherds with the herds of cattle." "Oh, very well, if mares and sheep and oxen can go that way, we can, so let's start at once." The signal for departure was given immediately, and they struck into the heart of the valley of Las Leges, between great masses of chalk crystal. From this point the pass began to be difficult and even dangerous. The angles of the declivities widened and the ledges narrowed, and frightful precipices met their gaze. The mules went cautiously along, keeping their heads near the ground, as if scenting the track. They marched in file. Sometimes at a sudden bend of the road, the madrina would disappear, and the little caravan had to guide themselves by the distant tinkle of her bell. Often some capricious winding would bring the column in two parallel lines, and the Catapez could speak to his peons across a crevasse not 2 fathoms wide, though 200 deep, which made between them an inseparable gulf. Glenarvan followed his guide step by step. He saw that his perplexity was increasing as the way became more difficult, but did not dare to interrogate him, rightly enough, perhaps, thinking that both mules and muleteers were very much governed by instinct, and it was best to trust to them. For about an hour longer the Catapez kept wandering about almost at haphazard, though always getting higher up the mountains. At last he was obliged to stop short. They were in a narrow valley, one of those gorges called by the Indians quebrads, and on reaching the end, a wall of porphyry rose perpendicularly before them and barred further passage. The Catapez, after vain attempts at finding an opening, dismounted, crossed his arms, and waited. Glenarvan went up to him and asked if he had lost his way. "No, your lordship," was the reply. "But you are not in the Pass of Antuco." "We are." "You are sure you are not mistaken?" "I am not mistaken. See, there are the remains of a fire left by the Indians, and there are the marks of the mares and the sheep." "They must have gone on then." "Yes, but no more will go. The last earthquake has made the route impassable." "To mules," said the major, "but not to men." "Ah, that's your concern. I have done all I could. My mules and myself are at your service to try the other passes of the Cordilleras." "And that would delay us." "3 days at least." Glenarvan listened silently. He saw the Catapez was right. His mules could not go farther. When he talked of returning, however, Glenarvan appealed to his companions and said, "Will you go on in spite of all the difficulty?" "We will follow your lordship," replied Tom Austin. "And even precede you," added Paganel. "What is it after all? We have only to cross the top of the mountain chain, and once over, nothing can be easier of descent than the slopes we shall find there. When we get below, we shall find Baquinos, Argentine shepherds who will guide us through the pampas, and swift horses accustomed to gallop over the plains. Let's go forward then, I say, and without a moment's hesitation. Forward, they all exclaimed. You will not go with us then? Said Glenarvan to the Castaways. I am the muleteer, was the reply. As you please, said Glenarvan. We can do without him, said Paganel. On the other side, we shall get back into the road to Antuco, and I'm quite sure I'll lead you to the foot of the mountain as straight as the best guide in the Cordilleras. Accordingly, Glenarvan settled accounts with the Castaways, and bade farewell to him and his peons and mules. The arms and instruments, and a small stock of provisions were divided among the 7 travelers, and it was unanimously agreed that the ascent should recommence at once, and, if necessary, should continue part of the night. There was a very steep winding path on the left, which the mules never would have attempted. It was toilsome work, but after 2 hours' exertion and a great deal of roundabout climbing, the little party found themselves once more in the pass of Antuco. They were not far now from the highest peak of the Cordilleras, but there was not the slightest trace of any beaten path. The entire region had been overturned by recent shocks of earthquake, and all they could do was to keep on climbing higher and higher. Paganel was rather disconcerted at finding no way out to the other side of the chain, and laid his account with having to undergo great fatigue before the topmost peaks of the Andes could be reached, for their mean height is between 11 and 12,600 feet. Fortunately, the weather was calm and the sky clear, in addition to the season being favorable, but in winter, from May to October, such an ascent would have been impracticable. The intense cold quickly kills travelers, and those who even manage to hold out against it fall victims to the violence of the temporals, a sort of hurricane peculiar to those regions, which yearly fills the abysses of the Cordilleras with dead bodies. They went on toiling steadily upward all night, hoisting themselves up to almost inaccessible plateaus and leaping over broad, deep crevasses. They had no ropes, but arms linked in arms supplied the lack, and shoulders served for ladders. The strength of Mulready and the dexterity of Wilson were taxed heavily now. These 2 brave Scots multiplied themselves, so to speak. Many a time, but for their devotion and courage, the small band could not have gone on. Glenarvan never lost sight of young Robert, for his age and vivacity made him imprudent. Paganel was a true Frenchman in his impetuous ardor, and hurried furiously along. The Major, on the contrary, only went as quick as was necessary, neither more nor less, climbing without the least apparent exertion. Perhaps he hardly knew, indeed, that he was climbing at all, or perhaps he fancied he was descending. The whole aspect of the region had now completely changed. Huge blocks of glittering ice, of a bluish tint on some of the declivities, stood up on all sides, reflecting the early light of morn. The ascent became very perilous. They were obliged to reconnoiter carefully before making a single step, on account of the crevasses. Wilson took the lead and tried the ground with his feet. His companions followed exactly in his footprints, lowering their voices to a whisper, as the least sound would disturb the currents of air, and might cause the fall of the masses of snow suspended in the air 700 or 800 feet above their heads. They had come now to the region of shrubs and bushes, which, higher still, gave place to grasses and cacti. At 11,000 feet, all trace of vegetation had disappeared. They had only stopped once, to rest and snatch a hurried meal to recruit their strength. With superhuman courage, the ascent was then resumed amid increasing dangers and difficulties. They were forced to bestride sharp peaks and leap over chasms so deep that they did not dare to look down them. In many places, wooden crosses marked the scene of some great catastrophes. About 2 o'clock they came to an immense barren plain, without a sign of vegetation. The air was dry and the sky unclouded blue. At this elevation rain is unknown, and vapors only condense into snow or hail. Here and there peaks of porphyry or basalt pierced through the white winding sheet like the bones of a skeleton, and at intervals fragments of quartz or gneiss, loosened by the action of the air, fell down with a faint, dull sound, which in a denser atmosphere would have been almost imperceptible. However, in spite of their courage, the strength of the little band was giving way. Glenarvan regretted they had gone so far into the interior of the mountain when he saw how exhausted his men had become. Young Robert held out manfully, but he could not go much farther. At 3 o'clock, Glenarvan stopped and said, "We must rest." He knew if he did not himself propose it, no one else would. "Rest," rejoined Paganel, "we have no place of shelter." "It is absolutely necessary, however, if it were only for Robert. No, no, said the courageous lad. I can still walk, don't stop. You shall be carried, my boy, but we must get to the other side of the Cordilleras. Cost what it may there, we may perhaps find some hut to cover us. All I ask is a 2 hours longer march. Are you all of the same opinion? Said Glenarvan. Yes, was the unanimous reply, and Mulrady added, I'll carry the boy. The march eastward was forthwith resumed. They had a frightful height to climb, yet to gain the topmost peaks. The rarefaction of the atmosphere produced that painful oppression known by the name of puna. Drops of blood stood on the gums and lips, and respiration became hurried and difficult. However strong the will of these brave men might be, the time came at last when their physical powers failed, and vertigo, that terrible malady in the mountains, destroyed not only their bodily strength but their moral energy. Falls became frequent, and those who fell could not rise again, but dragged themselves along on their knees. But just as exhaustion was about to make short work of any further ascent, and Glenarvan's heart began to sink as he thought of the snow lying far as the eye could reach, and of the intense cold, and saw the shadow of night fast overspreading the desolate peaks, and knew they had not a roof to shelter them. Suddenly the Major stopped and said, in a calm voice, a hut. Chapter 13, A Sudden Descent. Anyone else but McNabbs might have passed the hut 100 times, and gone all round it, and even over it without suspecting its existence. It was covered with snow, and scarcely distinguishable from the surrounding rocks, but Wilson and Mulrady succeeded in digging it out and clearing the opening after half an hour's hard work, to the great joy of the whole party, who eagerly took possession of it. They found it was a casucha, constructed by the Indians, made of adobes, a species of bricks baked in the sun. Its form was that of a cube, 12 feet on each side, and it stood on a block of basalt. A stone stair led up to the door, the only opening, and narrow as this door was, the hurricane and snow and hail found their way in when the temporals were unchained in the mountains. 10 people could easily find room in it, and though the walls might be none too watertight in the rainy season, at this time of the year, at any rate, it was sufficient protection against the intense cold, which, according to the thermometer, was 10 degrees below zero. Besides, there was a sort of fireplace in it, with a chimney of bricks, badly enough put together, certainly, but still it allowed of a fire being lighted. This will shelter us at any rate, said Glenarvan, even if it is not very comfortable. Providence has led us to it, and we can only be thankful. Why, it is a perfect palace, I call it, said Paganel. We only want flunkies and courtiers. We shall do capital here. Especially when there is a good fire blazing on the hearth, for we are quite as cold as we are hungry. For my part, I would rather see a good faggot just now than a slice of venison. Well, Tom, we'll try and get some combustible or other, said Paganel. Combustibles on the top of the Cordilleras? Exclaimed Mulrady in a dubious tone. Since there is a chimney in the casucha, said the Major, the probability is that we shall find something to burn in it. Our friend McNabbs is right, said Glenarvan. Get everything in readiness for supper, and I'll go out and turn woodcutter. Wilson and I will go with you, said Paganel. Do you want me? Asked Robert, getting up. No, my brave boy, rest yourself. You'll be a man when others are only children at your age, replied Glenarvan. On reaching the little mound of porphyry, Glenarvan and his two companions left the casucha. In spite of the perfect calmness of the atmosphere, the cold was stinging. Paganel consulted his barometer and found that the depression of the mercury corresponded to an elevation of 11,000 feet, only 910 meters lower than Mont Blanc. But if these mountains had presented the difficulties of the giant of the Swiss Alps, not one of the travelers could have crossed the great chain of the New World. On reaching a little mound of porphyry, Glenarvan and Paganel stopped to gaze about them and scan the horizon on all sides. They were now on the summit of the Nevadas of the Cordilleras and could see over an area of 40 miles. The valley of the Colorado was already sunk in shadow, and night was fast drawing her mantle over the eastern slopes of the Andes. The western side was illumined by the rays of the setting sun, and peaks and glaciers flashed back his golden beams with dazzling radiance. On the south, the view was magnificent. Across the wild valley of the Torbido, about 2 miles distant, rose the volcano of Antuco. The mountain roared like some enormous monster, and vomited red smoke, mingled with torrents of sooty flame. The surrounding peaks appeared on fire. Showers of red-hot stones, clouds of reddish vapor and rockets of lava, all combined, presented the appearance of glowing, sparkling streams. The splendor of the spectacle increased every instant as night deepened, and the whole sky became lighted up with a dazzling reflection of the blazing crater, while the sun, gradually becoming shorn of his sunset glories, disappeared like a star lost in the distant darkness of the horizon. Paganel and Glenarvan would have remained long enough gazing at the sublime struggle between the fires of earth and heaven if the more practical Wilson had not reminded them of the business on hand. There was no wood to be found, however, but fortunately the rocks were covered with a poor, dry species of lichen. Of this they made an ample provision, as well as of a plant called loretta, the root of which burns tolerably well. This precious combustible was carried back to the casucha and heaped up on the hearth. It was a difficult matter to kindle it, though, and still more to keep it alight. The air was so rarefied that there was scarcely oxygen enough in it to support combustion. At least, this was the reason assigned by the major. By way of compensation, however, he added, water will boil at less than 100 degrees heat. It will come to the point of ebullition before 99 degrees. McNabbs was right, as the thermometer proved, for it was plunged into the kettle when the water boiled, and the mercury only rose to 99 degrees. Coffee was soon ready and eagerly gulped down by everybody. The dry meat certainly seemed poor fare, and Paganel couldn't help saying, I tell you what, some grilled llama wouldn't be bad with this, would it? They say that the llama is substitute for the ox and the sheep, and I should like to know if it is, in an alimentary respect. What? Replied the major. You're not content with your supper, most learned Paganel. Enchanted with it, my brave major, still I must confess I should not say no to a dish of llama. You are a sybarite. I plead guilty to the charge. But come, now though you call me that, you wouldn't sulk at a beefsteak yourself, would you? Probably not. And if you were asked to lie in wait for a llama, notwithstanding the cold and the darkness, you would do it without the least hesitation. Of course, and if it will give you the slightest pleasure. His companions had hardly time to thank him for his obliging good nature, when distant and prolonged howls broke on their ear, plainly not proceeding from one or two solitary animals, but from a whole troop, and one, moreover, that was rapidly approaching. Providence had sent them a supper, as well as led them to a hut. This was the geographer's conclusion, but Glenarvan damped his joy somewhat by remarking that the quadrupeds of the Cordilleras are never met with in such a high latitude. Then where can these animals come from? Asked Tom Austin. Don't you hear them getting nearer? An avalanche, suggested Mulready. Impossible, returned Paganel. That is regular howling. Let us go out and see, said Glenarvan. Yes, and be ready for hunting, replied McNabbs, arming himself with his carbine. They all rushed forthwith out of the casucha. Night had completely set in, dark and starry. The moon, now in her last quarter, had not yet risen. The peaks on the north and east had disappeared from view, and nothing was visible save the fantastic silhouette of some towering rocks here and there. The howls, and clearly the howls of terrified animals, were redoubled. They proceeded from that part of the Cordilleras which lay in darkness. What could be going on there? Suddenly a furious avalanche came down, an avalanche of living animals mad with fear. The whole plateau seemed to tremble. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of these animals, and in spite of the rarefied atmosphere, their noise was deafening. Were they wild beasts from the pampas, or herds of llamas and vicunas? Glenarvan, McNabbs, Robert, Austin, and the two sailors had just time to throw themselves flat on the ground before they swept past like a whirlwind, only a few paces distant. Paganel, who had remained standing, to take advantage of his peculiar powers of sight, was knocked down in a twinkling. At the same moment the report of firearms was heard. The major had fired, and it seemed to him that an animal had fallen close by, and that the whole herd, yelling louder than ever, had rushed down and disappeared among the declivities lighted up by the reflection of the volcano. Ah, I've got them, said a voice, the voice of Paganel. Got what? Asked Glenarvan. My spectacles, was the reply. One might expect to lose that much in such a tumult as this. You are not wounded, I hope. No, only knocked down, but by what? By this, replied the major, holding up the animal he had killed. They all hastened eagerly into the hut, to examine McNabbs' prize by the light of the fire. It was a pretty creature, like a small camel without a hump. The head was small and the body flattened, the legs were long and slender, the skin fine, and the hair the color of café au lait. Paganel had scarcely looked at it before he exclaimed, "A guanaco." "What sort of an animal is that?" asked Glenarvan. "One you can eat." "And it is good savory meat, I assure you, a dish of Olympus. I knew we should have fresh meat for supper and such meat, but who is going to cut up the beast?" "I will," said Wilson. "Well, I'll undertake to cook it," said Paganel. "Can you cook then, Monsieur Paganel?" asked Robert. "I should think so, my boy. I'm a Frenchman, and in every Frenchman there is a cook." 5 minutes afterward Paganel began to grill large slices of venison on the embers made by the use of the Lorettas, and in about 10 minutes a dish was ready, which he served up to his companions by the tempting name of guanaco cutlets. No one stood on ceremony, but fell to with a hearty good will. To the absolute stupefaction of the geographer, however, the first mouthful was greeted with a general grimace, and such exclamations as "tough," "it is horrible," "it is not eatable." The poor savant was obliged to own that his cutlets could not be relished, even by hungry men. They began to banter him about his Olympian dish, and indulge in jokes at his expense. But all he cared about was to find out how it happened that the flesh of the guanaco, which was certainly good and eatable food, had turned out so badly in his hands. At last light broke in on him, and he called out,